Hello, Jerry. How are you?
Doing good. How about you?
You know what? Can't complain. Can't complain. I've got my health. Got my health.
Absolutely.
Um, we live in. I kind of started so many of these by saying we live in, kind of extraordinary times, but we absolutely do. If you create a podcast about the American presidency, um, can you think of another year where the commander in chief has been so tested and so vilified by Americans?
Absolutely. And that's the thing. That's one of the things that's always fascinated me about the American presidency is that there have been so many moments of great stress and
Mhm.
strain and challenges. And in some cases, presidents have risen to the occasion and met the challenges. In some cases, they haven't. And we continue to see that even up to the present day. And ultimately, history will judge the current president just as it does all the others. Um, Thinking about the long history of America, and in particular, one that whenever I think of really challenging times, I always come back to the Civil War. There was so much that was happening during that time, and the nation was falling apart. And here comes a president who really was somewhat of a political novice. He had served in some offices, but he really hadn't been a national leader until he assumed the presidency. And it's amazing to read about that time and how it really defined and redefined the office of the presidency and the role of the presidency, and how President Lincoln had to face the challenges, and in some cases he rose to the occasion. But as with anything, there is room for criticism and critique, and that I think is the ultimate that is the ultimate epitome of the presidency, is that it's an office that is a public trust. It's a public office, and all citizens have a right to put their 2 cents in on how the president is doing, and then it becomes history, and historians enter into the conversation. um, the challenges of the office are great. The opportunities to change things for the better are great.
Mhm.
And being able to go through that history and see what worked and what didn't, who succeeded, who failed, and seeing all the other people that are involved in that, it's amazing. It is what keeps me going in the podcast, as well as just my general interest.
So you raised something very interesting there when you were talking about Lincoln. You said that Lincoln changed the presidency. He helped define exactly what a president does. So if I'm to do a quick snapshot of American presidents in terms of presidents which have really shaped the office, very obviously you have to start with Washington. Um, I think you can also maybe throw in Jefferson there. You can throw in Lincoln very obviously. These are the very obvious ones which I'm doing, and you're going to understand the reason why. TR, FDR, and I'd throw even maybe Reagan in there as well. So those presidents are the ones which I think historians would say that they redefined the presidency. Who do you think needs to also be up in that pantheon? Who else do you think actually, not that he was necessarily a good president or a bad, but he helped to define the role of the president?
Well, and that's one of the things that I really enjoy about presidential history, is that you get the figures that kind of everybody knows. They're the
Mhm.
big figures. You mentioned many of the key ones. But then you also see, whenever you start getting into some of the lesser known presidents and starting to get into the stories of those presidents and those presidencies, you see other moments that people don't really know. And that's what I enjoy about the podcast, is being able to bring those moments to light, to be able to bring that to the audience's attention. Case in point, John Adams typically isn't considered a great president. In many histories, they skip over the Adams presidency. It goes straight from Washington. Oh, Adams was president for 4 years, and then Jefferson became president. But in Adams's presidency, you see, first of all, the first peaceful transfer of power from one president to another. Then at the end, you see the first peaceful transfer of power from one president of one political party or political faction to another. That in and of itself is, those two moments are defining in the presidency, in American history. And really, there were a few examples of that to that point in world history that we really can speak to.
I'm going to pull you up, right? It's one of the things which I always, it all sticks slightly in my throat, being British.
Mm-hmm.
But Americans always say we have this peaceful transfer of power. Britain had been doing that for the last 50 years beforehand. You had conservative administrations and liberal ones, and they alternated. Do not get me wrong, this was a very limited franchise, but we'd been doing that for 50 years beforehand. And I always get the sense that Americans go, yeah, like we're the first quasi-democracy to do that. It's not the case. So my question to you is, why do you think that Americans have this blind spot? Because whenever there's a presidential inauguration, it's always the same, peaceful transfer of power. The Danes have been doing that for quite some time. The Brits predated you Americans.
Well, and that's part of the reason why I used the qualifier. It was rare in history. But part of what comes into that, and you can probably speak more to the British side of history, but the voting franchise and how parliaments were elected was a bit different than how things were done in the US. And that's the thing. I think that there is this idea, and it does grow in American history, this idea of American exceptionalism, that I think that is a bit of a blind spot, to your point. I think that, and that's also something that I really try and work through in the podcast, is connecting American history to world history. Because again, often in American histories, they just focus on what was going on in the US, or if there's a mention of something, it's usually with larger partners like Britain, France. But we had relations with so many different nations and so many different peoples around the globe, even in the earlier days of the United States and of the United States under the Constitution. And I think those are important stories, and they did play a role in what America was. Also, there's this false assumption that, everybody spoke English in the US. It wasn't true. There were still large communities, and this is just thinking of like Washington and Adams's time, and the US being kind of those 13 original colonies. Even in that, there were people who spoke, there were Dutch-speaking communities, there were German-speaking communities, there were French-speaking communities. There were also, and especially an important point in American history that cannot be overstated is enslaved individuals and people of color who were brought over to the U.S. against their will. And in those cases, you have some people who speak Arabic, you have people who speak various languages. And the history of the United States is so much more multicultural and diverse, and it's important to highlight those stories and to get beyond this idea that there was just this one clean-cut narrative.
But I think you raise a really, really interesting point. And then very obviously, you know, there were the native peoples as well, and the languages that they spoke. But looking necessarily at giving presidential history a cursory glance, not a deep dive, but a cursory glance, you don't necessarily get that rich tapestry of the whole of the American populace, though, do you? Because I remember discovering that Van Buren was the only president of which English was not his first language, was not his mother tongue. And I'm going, oh, you know, and it goes exactly to your point. You know, there's a reason why Manhattan is called Manhattan, and there are so many Dutch names around New York, is because the Dutch kind of founded it first, type of thing. You know, so do you think that American history and presidential history, and let's bring this really up to date now, will go through a pivot point because of the inflection point of 2020 and the murder of George Floyd? It seems to me that there is very much a reappraisal of American identity and American power and civic responsibility, whether that's to do with protest, etc., etc. So, taking a broad sweep of American history, but still using the presidency as a point of reference, will we view American history different because of 2020?
Absolutely. I think that it's and the study and the scholarship in American history was already changing. I think that what is occurring in the historical present is going to further that change, and I think take it in directions that it may not have gone before. And I think it's important to do that. I think that the history becomes richer when you do that deep dive, and that's something that I do on the podcast. After 3.5 years now, I'm just up to 1803, and I typically post episodes every couple of weeks because I want to get to those stories. I want to get to the stories that people
Jerry, sorry,
don't
let's understand what you've just said. You've been doing the podcast for 2.5 years.
3.5.
3.5. I take it it's chronological, and you're only up to 1803.
Yes.
Oh wow. Okay. I was just
It's
checking.
a deep dive.
You're not lying to me.
Well, and that's the thing. Like, there are so many rich stories that just haven't been told, and you read histories of the past, histories that were done in previous times and previous eras, and it's unrelatable. It When you just have this very cursory glance, it's very whitewashed, it's very polished. It's not relatable because it's not real. It's not what happened. It's getting in those stories and getting to the history that is complicated and troubling and requires thought, requires reflection. That's where you get to humanity. And that's where we get to what history should be, which is connecting with people in times that are not our own, but that had an influence on getting us to the present day. And I think that we are in a time, and this is a year when many people are reflecting on where we're at, where we've been, and hopefully where we're going. And I'm cautiously optimistic that this reflection will see better things, but we've also got to remember the past and remember the legacy that it has left us and still impacts us to this day. And in all respects, and as somebody who's interested in presidential history, what that has to tell us about where we're moving forward and what leaders we need to help us to move forward.
Well said, sir. Why did you start your podcast?
So,
Bearing in mind that potentially you and I should be at loggerheads because I do a presidential history podcast and you do one. So shouldn't we be deadly enemies or something or another?
I think there's more than enough history and more than enough room to discuss presidential history. For me, I've always been interested in presidential history for as long as I can remember. I still remember, and dating myself a little bit here, when I was a kid, we still had the actual physical encyclopedias. And so I would just start reading about a president, and then that would lead me to another topic. I'd go and pull off another volume. That would lead me to another topic, and I'd end up having half the encyclopedia out on the floor. When we had the election of 2016, and it was an unprecedented election in many respects. I had friends, I had colleagues who came to me with questions. What does this mean? What does the Constitution have to say about this? Have we ever seen anything like this before? And it made me realize there was an interest and a need to share some of the information that I've learned over the years. I actually took some time to read, and this was prior to starting the podcast, reading a presidential biography, a full biography of the life of each president from beginning, from Washington on up to the present day. And I realized that there was an interest and a need to understand that history. And so that's when I started Presidencies. And I started it with the idea that it was going to be a deep dive. I wanted to show not just the individual in the office, because one person can't do everything. One person doesn't make a presidency. They depend on advisors, they depend on people who we may never even hear about until you start doing that deep dive. Also, the enemies that they had, or the opponents, the events that were going on. There's so much that goes into that rich history, and so that's why I do the deep dive. And someday I plan on getting out of 1803. I'm hoping in the next couple of episodes, but
Whilst you're thinking about how you leave 1803, obviously you're going to be part of Intelligent Speech, which is happening on June the 27th. What is the topic that you're going to be presenting and why?
So I'm going to be presenting on the rebellions of the early presidencies. Again, it's trying to get at some of that history that people aren't as familiar with. I think when people think of George Washington's presidency, they think, oh, well, Washington was the leader that everybody rallied around. There were no problems. We had a strong government. And it wasn't the case. And again, this idea of American exceptionalism, oh, well, once we had the Constitution, everything was going to work out. No, there were great concerns that at any moment it was all going to fall apart. And there were people who this didn't work for, and they rebelled in numerous ways. And I look forward to sharing some of that with the participants at the conference.
Brilliant. Jerry Landry, tell us what the name of your podcast is again, sir.
My podcast is The Presidencies of the United States.
and it's a rather good podcast. Thank you for coming on to Intelligent Speech and just whetting our appetite as to what we can expect on June the 27th.
Looking forward to it. Thank you for having me.